Director of the United Nations Program on HIV/AIDS, and United Nations Assistant Secretary General Dr. Anjali Autrekar for a conversation on eradicating AIDS by 2030 with FP's Executive Editor, Amelia Lester.
Today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm excited to talk about what is, by all accounts, somewhat of a good news story, because we're here to talk about eradicating AIDS by 2030. And I wondered if you could start off by telling us a little bit about where we're seeing progress and where we are more generally in the fight against AIDS. It's been nearly 40 years now.
Well, first, thank you for having me. It's really an honor to be here today to talk about something that is actually a shiny, bright star. What we have seen in the 40 years is moving from death and despair to life and hope, to promise and possibility. That's what we've seen in the global HIV response, and it's been extraordinary. You know, and this is across the globe, we now have, of the 39 million, people that are living with HIV and AIDS, we have 30 million of those 39 million that are on life-saving treatment. That's an enormous testament. We still do not have a vaccine or a cure, but we have incredible progress that we're seeing. In fact, it's really interesting to be here during the UNGA week, where many of the Sustainable Development Goals are struggling. What we see in the HIV response is success. We see countries that have moved along this path and are making progress toward their Sustainable Development Goals, unlike all the other SDGs. And this is really a testament of the power of partnership.
Yeah, I'm excited to dig in a little bit on how we got here, and perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the role that legal and policy frameworks have had in making this amazing progress.
Absolutely. I come from the United Nations, and what UNAIDS is a joint United Nations program on HIV and AIDS. It was created in 1996. To respond in a comprehensive way to a comprehensive problem. And so this is the only joint program that exists that includes 11 different UN agencies with different disciplines across finance, across human rights, across health, across women's issues, children's issues. And what has been important then and what is important now is that UNAIDS, together with governments across the world, have come together to develop a plan that holds all of us to account. We have 5-year targets that we come together always to say, where are we against these targets? How are we progressing forward? We have a declaration where we have that outlines the work that we do together, that signals the incredibly important characteristics of what it is that takes to end AIDS and what we need to do and what all governments and communities need to do to continue along the fight.
What's really striking to me here is how the world came together and then set itself accountability goals to check in on progress. I'm wondering what this fight against AIDS has taught us about combating future pandemics.
Well, it's interesting. AIDS is a pandemic. We have 40 years of experience fighting one of the largest global threats, and we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot in those 40 years, what works, what doesn't work, how we need to come together in a multi-sectoral way. And so what we've learned about pandemics, and most recently through the COVID-19 pandemic, while we've been battling and fighting HIV, is that many of the lessons that we've learned from the HIV response are indeed applicable to other pandemics. Same for COVID-19, for Ebola, for H1N1, for MERS, for SARS. Many of these, and they're similar things. The power of, and what we learned in the HIV response and what we continue to learn, is how important it is to have person-centered care, to have communities at the center of what our focus is, to work in a multi-sectoral way, bringing multiple disciplines together, bringing multiple ministries from governments together, bringing parliamentarians together with health officials, bringing finance together with gender and justice and what that looks like. And as you said, accountability metrics, that's something, using data and evidence, that's something that we have championed and treasured in the HIV response. And I think that's something that, as we think about these broader frameworks, there's a lot that we can learn from the HIV response.
One issue I really want to get to here is PEPFAR. Global solidarity has obviously been key in the HIV response, but in some ways the United States has really led that fight, particularly with PEPFAR, or the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, started by the Bush administration in 2003, saved an estimated 25 million lives. It needs to be renewed by Congress this year, doesn't it? So you've helped lead it. Tell us why reauthorization is important and what's at stake in that renewal.
Thank you for that question. And it is indeed, when we talk about the global HIV response, and when I talked about some of the incredible progress that the globe has made together, a really important reason a lot of that progress has happened is because of the American people, is because of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. And what that is an enormous partnership and enormous amount of funding and political commitment and will that has come together with the launch in 2003 by President George W. Bush and the continued bipartisan, bicameral support across the subsequent administrations and Congresses to put their resources where the possibility and impact and the need really was. The U.S. government had, over the past 20 years, invested over $110 billion into the HIV response that has represented the U.S.'s contribution to the global HIV response. And it's been an extraordinary partnership between the U.S. government and partner governments and communities in over 55 countries. That very investment and that very partnership has resulted in 25 million lives saved. It's resulted in systems, local systems that have been strengthened, laboratory systems, surveillance systems, supply chain systems, health and community health workers that have been strengthened through the HIV response that both save lives, but also build local capacity so that countries can continue to respond to HIV, but also be prepared for other pandemics. So PEPFAR reauthorization and continuing that bipartisan support is essential. We have not yet finished the fight. Despite the progress that I described earlier in the HIV response, we still have 9 million people that are in need of treatment that do not have treatment, including mothers and babies and adolescent girls and young women and key populations where new infections are rising. We need PEPFAR to be continued, to be extended for another 5 years as the law continues, and funded so that we can continue to finish the fight and sustain those gains into the future well beyond 2030.
Well, that was an important call to action, I think, for Washington and for policymakers. And let's hope that the race to the finish line in 2030 continues apace. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this time.
All right, well, I'm excited to introduce our next guest, is Arjan Tor, who is the CEO of Cigna Europe. He has held this position since January 2020. Thank you for joining us today. Arjan, this